everyone, and welcome back to our Riftforge Studio tutorial series. And in this episode we're going to be looking at frozen woodland bases, and I'm going to be basing this on this bolt action German mortar team. This is going to be a kind of essentially a multi-part tutorial. You can stop at the woodland part, it doesn't have to be frozen, but the ultimate aim is to create, as you've seen in the thumbnail, no doubt, in the title card, that frozen base, and trying to make it look as realistic as possible for this frozen German themed army. I'm going to now move in to remove these models, just because there's an aspect of this tutorial where we want to be able to add and remove the models back after basing for casualties taken during the game, those sorts of things. So here you can see that I've removed the models from the base. I've tried to clean that up as much as possible. I glued these to the base before I decided I was going to do this with them, so you don't always have to do this. This is just part of the tutorial that I've had to do for my own personal use. And then what we're going to do is we're going to take some basing texture. I'm using AK Terrain's Dark Earth here. Of course, there are multiple other options out there, and it's user's preference really. What we're trying to get though is that kind of natural colour of a pine or sort of mixed tree woodland ground. This is the right sort of brown colour. We won't have to paint it once it's dried. You'll see a little bit later it dries quite dark, which is about the right colour we're after. It's got that sand and grit texture in it that will give us a sort of a realistic idea of a woodland floor, and ultimately it's going to be covered by things like greenery and snow anyway. So I'm going to use one of the flat edge sculpting tools, as you can see, and I'm going to try to just sort of fairly neatly but also kind of quickly apply this basing texture. And we don't want it smooth. As you can see, there are a few ridges, little bits where it kind of comes up, it's not completely flat. That's fine, you know, we're not plastering a wall, we're trying to create some character and some texture in this base. And then I'm just adding a little bit more at the front there, because this aspect is going to be the front of the base, and that's where we're going to put the mortar shield for this gun emplacement. Now, we don't want to let this completely dry before we start the next stages. As you can see from the sheen, it's still quite damp. You could probably rub this off quite easily still. But what we want to try and incorporate is the next stages of the base into that bottom layer before it's dried. We don't want the models to sit on this rough textured surface, because they won't sit flat, they'll probably break off, it'll damage the base, etc, etc. As well as the sticks that we're going to use to build up the mortar position, we want them to sit neatly, to sit quite firmly and securely within the base itself. So the next stage from this point is going to be to add the models back in to create that kind of footprint for where they'll sit, so that once things are dry, we can add and remove them if the crew takes casualties, or if there are, you know, kind of other considerations, whether that's storage or whatever. So as you can see here, I'm just going to try and position those models so that they kind of fit with how I want the crew to look. Because that texture isn't dry, there's quite a lot of malleability with it still. We can move it around, we can push some of that texture around with tools or just with the models themselves, and then work with what that's going to look like. This will take quite a while to dry, so we're going to come back to this once it started to dry a little bit more. And as you can see here, it has started to dry a little bit more, but it's still not completely dry. This is going to be where we take these sticks. These ones are from Woodland Scenics. They're a favourite of mine for this sort of thing. You can use other suppliers, you can use fake ones, plastic ones, resin ones, you know, green stuff ones, whatever. I just find these are cheap, easy to use, ready to use, and again, with the rest of the base, they won't need painting. They already look like sticks and logs should look, so that's perfect. So we're going to push this base layer into the texture on the bottom, and that's going to create this sort of firm position to add the rest of the logs on top to create that kind of firm position. It'll dry into the base, it'll be sturdy, there won't be any issues. And we're just going to build up with a little bit more of the textured paint, build up around this position. Again, it helps to make it look like it's not just sort of logs miraculously and magically floating on top of each other, but also helps us to create that stability across the base. And we're going to leave that to dry before we start to look at other aspects, and we're going to go down the sides as well as across the top, but we're going to have to do this in stages to make sure that it doesn't all fall over in a heap of sticks. So as you can see from the colour and the sheen now, this has dried a lot more than it had on the previous stages, but still isn't completely dry. At this point, it's not really a big problem. You're probably not going to affect it too much, but we also need to be able to remove these individual models without it cracking or pulling up huge chunks of the base itself. So we're going to take these off now, and then going to clean up the models and the base to make those models sit back in those gaps without any balancing issues, to make sure they sit flat, sit smoothly, but also so they're not going to get stuck, we're not going to damage the base, those sorts of things. Again, I'm using the same sculpting tool just to sort of dig those bits out, and whatever I need to do to wipe off the textured paint off the bottom of the models themselves. As you can sort of probably guess, if this isn't the approach you're going for with this base, you just want to create the base itself, or you're going to do the base around the models, this is a completely optional stage that you can just skip right past for a couple of seconds, unless you just want to listen to my amazing voice talk this through. But we're just going to clear this off again, just to make sure that there's a smooth surface. I mean, anyone that's worked with bolt action knows that there's no such thing as a smooth flat surface on the bottom of a lot of these models anyway, particularly the older metal ones like this kit. But we're just going to keep playing with that to make sure they all fit in the right place. There aren't going to be any issues, they're not overbalanced, underbalanced, so that we can secure them with magnets or pins, but they will stand alone if we need them to. And just putting the mortar back on there, and I think that's all of these models now tested and fit, so that we know how they're going to work. The next stage, everything's dried a little bit more. Again, still not completely dry, but that's not a problem. If you rush this textured paint, it can crack and start to look a bit rubbish. It can also affect the integrity of how well it sticks to the base itself. So just let it dry in its own time. Don't worry too much about kind of messing things up, because you can always add to it, or put some base on top. But now we're going to look at adding the rest of the logs to this gun shield, and we're just going to use super glue. Do be careful when you do this. Some of the logs, obviously it's real wood, they can take a little bit longer to dry than something like plastic or resin, because it is quite porous. Equally, it can also dry really quickly depending on kind of whatever the properties of the bits of stick are. You'll see throughout this that I managed to try to add bits a bit too early and knock stuff over, but it's easily recoverable. You can see as I do it, it's not a problem, but just be careful not to glue all the sticks to your hand or to the rest of the base and kind of have to tear things up and about here. So we're just going to add these sticks in that sort of pattern, and what we're trying to create here is that height. If you think something like a mortar position would want to be almost entirely obscured from view, they don't need direct line of sight, so you can build this up to the point where you can pretty much just see the heads of the crew that I've got, and you'll see that at the end. We've added those. That's, I think, five logs or sticks high. That's all stuck quite nicely. It does look at the minute like they are magically balancing on top of each other. We will of course fix that shortly, but what we're going to do now is we're going to look to add a little bit more enclosement, that's not a word, concealment and sort of enclosed space for this mortar pit, and we're going to add the same sort of style of sticks down the sides, just to again create that aspect of cover. Of course it's not going to be actual cover, it's just for modelling purposes, but you get the point. So the same as what we did before, we're going to try and just sort of push some of these bottom sticks into that basing layer, just to sort of create an almost divot. The basing layer is almost dry, but not completely at this point, so it will create a slight ditch for it to sit in, and then we'll just use the super glue to secure it. Had a bit of a camera moment there, apologies. And we're just going to do what we did before, build that layer up. These are some of the sticks that I had problems with. They kept knocking over, and I kept having to apply some more glue. They weren't sticking very well, so just be aware that that is possible with some of this type of basing material. And for anyone thinking at this point, it's actual wood. It's quite porous. As you can see, it's sucking up some of that super glue quite a lot. The layers of PVA we're going to add in different stages to this base. It's going to seal it all, so there shouldn't be any issues going forward, you know, kind of storage or mold and things appearing, given that it's an actual organic material. So just don't worry too much about that at this stage. So we're going to carry on in stages of trying to do both sides of this mortar pit. Again, you don't have to be too precise, too rough. You know, think of how a couple of people in the freezing cold would be, you know, kind of building this position. They're not going to be full-blown architects, but they are going to be quite keen on keeping their position as concealed as possible without having to create, you know, a log cabin. So just place them in that kind of rough sort of placement, and how you would kind of think about how you might want to conceal yourself if you were in this position and you were doing this in real life. But also, we want to keep some of those interesting parts of the sticks, you know, the knots, the broken off branches, to show that things have been chopped down or picked up off the floor to sort of make this position. And that's pretty much the sides and front of this mortar pit done. We're just going to add a few more of the little logs just to the tops. Again, you don't have to be symmetrical with this. I am, because that's how my brain works, as symmetrical as possible. So I end up adding a couple more here and there just to sort of even this position out. But again, it's not really necessary, because we are going to cover this in greenery and other sort of products, which will make the whole picture uneven anyway. That's the point, right? If you want to be concealed, you don't want to create something that looks like it was created. You want to make it a little bit more kind of natural in that sort of sense. So that's the position itself, built up and at the base point, front, sides and back. And we're going to let that dry and move on to the next stage. The next stage is part of what I was talking about. We're going to use cocktail sticks in this case. I'm going to use these to cut down and make into kind of stakes. You know, that is wooden stakes to part of an ad hoc frame to stop the position falling in on the crew, for it being pushed over, it, you know, kind of just being supported in some way. Cocktail sticks are perfect for this because they kind of look like fresh cut pine anyway. If you want, after the fact, you can give these a little bit of a brown wash just to take the tone back, so they don't look you know, like fresh wood where the rest of it looks a little bit more natural. But again, that's user's choice. What we're going to do here is just, as you can see, press the ends of the cocktail sticks into the base. The material we used is still not completely dry, but it is mostly dry. And what we're doing here is just creating those spaces to slot these wooden stakes into. We'll super glue them in place and chop them down to size. Now again, there are loads of different ways you can do this. It'll mostly link to if you were, you know, in a position where you thought you had to build this sort of position in the middle of the woods with no gear and equipment, how you might look to stabilize your position. You know, talk to anyone who's been in the military, and you could have 5 groups of these crews in a row, and not one of those positions would look the same. They would all look different depending on who built it, what they were prioritizing. So they don't have to look symmetrical. They'll look different across different teams. They don't have to look that symmetrical here. You can cut the stakes at different heights, so long as it looks naturally like it might actually support the thing we're trying to make it look like it supports. Again, you can see while I'm putting these in, parts of that gun emplacement wobble a little bit. Don't worry about that. We're going to have, as I mentioned, a few extra stages which will, as a whole, help to stabilize all of the parts of this base, whether that's with super glue, more basing material, PVA, all the associated pieces that are going to go on top of this. And I think that's one of my main observations for this base, is that it will look quite good, but it'll take quite a bit of time because of the amount of stages that involve PVA, which you don't really want to try and speed up the curing or setting of, because it might affect the base in ways that you're not really happy with. There we go. I've gone round, I've put those stakes in, I've evened them out a little bit. Again, symmetry in my head is the way I like it. There's a bit of a camera error there where there was a bit of corrupted video, so apologies, it kind of skips a few seconds. But here we go. Now, as I mentioned, we're just going to add this little stage in, which is going to be to try and stabilize this point of the base. To do that, so these stakes don't look like they've just barely driven into the ground, we're going to add a little bit of an extra layer of some of the basing material that we used for the very first layer of the base, and that's just going to be built up around these points, built up around the bottom of the sort of shielded areas, just to again make it look like some effort has gone into making this built up position as secure as it can be made by the individuals trying to make it in the time given. So we're just going around all those points, being a little bit more careful because we don't want to have to re-dig out those crew positions, trying to feed that material in and around the stakes, in and around the base of the log piles, just sort of feed it between the support structures, just to make it again feel a little bit more like some effort has gone into trying to make this position something that isn't temporary, quite flimsy, all those sorts of things. So going again around the front a little bit, trying to build up that picture of, and I dropped the base. Thankfully everything's dried. That's a good test. Just trying to build it up a little bit, adding some of that security, some of that natural aspect. If you want, you can use this material to gap fill some of the bits between the logs. If you were doing this in real life, you would probably want to add some of that material to try and sort of stabilize the log structures themselves. You can use moss, you can use branches, you can use some of the dried or frozen earth. In this case I don't bother because again most of the front of this base is going to be covered in snowy greenery, so I don't really think it matters too much. But if that's the way you want to do it, if you want to stop at the woodland base and not kind of go as OTT as I do, then you can gap fill, of course. So moving on to the next stage, again you can see that some of this material hasn't quite dried. That's fine because the next stage is going to be putting a base layer of PVA and some ground cover. As you can see, this is already looking pretty good. You could probably keep this as a position as it is now, as some sort of entrenched position in a different sort of themed force or kind of whatever. But I'm using some of this base ready pine forest cover from the chaps over at Geek Gaming Scenics. I really like this stuff. I like a lot of their things. I'll put some links in the description, but I use a fair amount of their stuff throughout this video just because I think it works really well, and I've been recommended by a few other people, so I can be part of that recommendation that they are not paying me for, I will just add. So we're just going to cover this in a pretty well thinned down layer of PVA. We don't want it too thick. It'll take ages to dry. It might result in kind of large clumpy areas of the basing material to build up in areas we might not want it to build up, so that's something to consider. But apply that base layer all over, stick it in a pot to keep things clean. You don't want to get told off like I would do, and then just cover it in the basing material. Just give it a good old dousing with the material that we're using here. You can go over this a few times. I did go over this again off camera, you'll see when we cut to the next part, but I wasn't massively happy with the front area of the base. Here you go, you can see that looks a little bit different. There's a bit more of the green out of there, some of the flock, some of the sort of material that is sort of built up a little bit. And actually, I'll be honest, I really like this base at this point. It kind of looks like a field position as opposed to a woodland position. You could have this, if you wanted to use it as, again, bolt action, as part of like D-Day forces or just sort of other European theatres. I think it would work perfectly well. But we're not stopping there. What we're going to do now is use some of the greenery. And again, as you can see here, this is natural material. I believe this is a type of moss, but it looks fairly convincingly to be kind of tree canopy branches and works perfectly for emulating pine forest, tree branches, things that have fallen, shrubbery, those sorts of things. So the PVA on this occasion we're going to leave quite thick, and we're going to dot it around anywhere we think and build up how you might want to build up that concealed position. The PVA wants to be thick in this case compared to the last stage because we kind of want it to have that grab. This is natural material. It might take a little bit of sticking. You might have to go back over some of the other areas because, of course, things don't always go to plan. You can see there, I've just pushed that down and it's essentially not sticking to anything anymore. So add a little bit more PVA over the top, add the next layers. And this is just do what you want territory. You know, you can add as much or as little of this stuff as you want. I've added quite a bit, thinking that what I want is to give a pretty big surface to the snow cover we're going to add at the end. If you're watching this tutorial because you want to do it purely as a kind of woodland base, you don't have to put as much of this on. Equally, you could put more than I put on. You know, it's entirely up to you. Some of the other models in this force will have like kind of simulated broken trees, those sorts of things. So that will try to emulate an actual downed tree in parts rather than just sort of piled up in front of this position. And just this first layer, we're going to add these sort of big lumps of this all over, tidy it up a little bit as we go. Also try to fluff it out a little bit. Sometimes this material does press down flat if you're a little bit heavy-handed with it, so can kind of ruin the whole point of what you're trying to achieve. But I'm just going to go over now with some of these gaps and look to just sort of bush them out a little bit with some of the smaller pieces, use the tweezers, use whatever it is you want to do, and just sort of make them a little bit more interesting, fill some of these gaps, add some bits in, break up that line of the top of this position a little bit. I don't think I've actually broken that line up as much as I probably would have liked to, but I'm overall happy with the result. So here we are. This is one stage you definitely want to make sure has completely dried before you start messing with it again. I know other stages didn't have to be dry, it didn't really matter. This stage, you want to make sure this is completely dry. Now, if you want to, you can go over this with a really thin down layer of PVA. It will seal in the branches, the other bits of organic material. It will keep them, you know, kind of from going bad in the future, depending on how you store them. I don't in this case because I'm going to cover it in this base ready snow powder, again from the guys over at Geek Gaming Scenics. And I'm going to be pretty heavy handed with this stuff because again it's a winter themed army. In this instance it's actually a kind of Bastogne Ardennes themed army, so pretty heavy winter, pretty heavy snow, trying to make it look like it's a very frozen and uncomfortable place to be. And I'm just going to go over the whole of the bits that I want to cover with a kind of maybe 50% thin down PVA solution. Again, we don't want it sitting in huge great blobs, but we also don't want it too watery that it just sort of seeps right into that material that we're putting it on. And just dot this around. You can put it everywhere, you can put it nowhere. I'm going to lean on the snow being heavier at the front of the position because there's activity behind it. You know, it wouldn't be allowed to build up too much with the guys moving around. And I'm just going to cover it in this stuff. Most of this won't stick, but we want to add too much rather than too little, otherwise you'll get those kind of glossy pools of dried PVA which will just look really bad and you'll need to cover up in layers and layers and layers. So you can do this in whichever way you want. I'm just grabbing the base and bashing it with a tool to get all those bits out of the nooks and crannies so I don't end up with bits of not dried snow all over the rest of my stuff. But as you can see, this is starting to look really good already in my view. But we're not done. I'm going to add a few more layers on top of this just to build up that perception of continually building layers of snow. You don't want it to look like there's just been a little bit. Sometimes if you're not careful, you'll, again, like I say, you'll be able to see the sort of the glossy dried up pools of PVA that haven't really had much stick to them. So I'm just going to go over with a fine, really soft brush, try to get rid of any of the loose material from in the positions where the models will sit, or from anywhere, whether it's, you know, we think it's tucked in with all the greenery and those sorts of stuff. And then I'm going to go over it with another thin layer of PVA in different places, just trying to build up that snow effect. Same principle as before, heavily watered down but not too much, and just build up or hit those gaps that didn't look like they hit too much of the snow before. Add it to wherever you want, whatever your user preference is. A little bit more behind in the corners where the crew probably wouldn't tread too much. And then same as before. In the pot, some bits like that you'll see will fall off. The PVA will stick it right back on, or you can take it off, it's up to you. And then boom, drown it in this stuff again. Give it a good old shake around, throw it all over the front, over the sides, whatever. And this is the final result. This is a little bit of off screen. I added some bits kind of to the undersides a little bit more, using the tool to scoop it in rather than just sort of drop it on from above. But that's it. I think this is really effective. I think this snow material, I tested 5 or 6 out from different suppliers. I like all of them for different reasons. This, I think, when you build it up in fine layers and don't rush it too much, looks really powdery, like it's had little bits of fresh snow every day. It's in a wood, so there's none of the glistening bits in there, which I think didn't quite suit this base. They might suit other bases, but of course it's preference. You know, if you have snow material that you already really like, you use it on other models, or you do a bit of testing yourself, that's entirely up to you. But that's that for this base. I think this is really simple to do, although it is a little bit time consuming. You don't have to paint this, although you can paint aspects of it if you want. I'll probably add, bits of stuff to the top, but that's that. That's our winter snow base for Riftforge Studios. So give us a like, subscribe and comment, and see you next time.